the economists and political scientists, some are critical cases. Not that they're so far away, but the variety of approaches within the different disciplines is already a challenge. And then I think there's a certain polarization. I don't want to go into that, but what I'm saying here is what I learned is the best way, or one of the best ways, to have scholars from different disciplines not necessarily engage in a meaningful exchange. That is pushing it, right? But we call it sort of mutually irritate each other, right? Mutual irritation, which then will be productively transformed into innovation. That is our approach. We're still somewhat in the irritation phase, but I must say it works. I forced scholars to do projects with each other. They would have never dreamt of doing a project. But you give them €500,000 and that actually helps. But still, so what we're seeing is at least these people do research together. That doesn't necessarily mean that they start incorporating insights from other disciplines. But you can see how research questions slightly change and how the discourses start to shift. But this is a long-term project, and I have no illusions that I will sort of have a lasting impact on economists here. I don't even try. But what I want to do is instead is at least illustrate how some political scientists approach what political scientists often are expected to do. I'm not sure whether this is also true for economists, but I mean, particularly in terms of crisis, politicians tend to turn to political scientists and say, here's the problem, tell us how to solve it. Or even better, here's the problem, we know the solution, you tell us that this is the solution so that we can sell it to the public, right? And this is not what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is I pick a very, well, whether this is a crisis or not, I'm going to discuss in a moment, but I at least pick a topic that occupies a lot of us, if not as scholars, then as citizens, namely the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and demonstrate a little bit how a political scientist approaches this topic using theory rather than my own personal opinion. I mean, we also believe in double reflexivity. And so we reflect our own positionality and normativity quite a bit, which some of my colleagues have difficulties with when they, for instance, sit in talk shows and tell the world how to end the war in Ukraine. So what I'm really trying to do is to give you a kind of scientific reflection on the challenge and show you the implications. Depending on what kind of theory you use, you'll see you sometimes arrive at the same conclusions, which do not necessarily present a solution, which is a huge problem, particularly for the political scientists that are expected to say something about how we can get out of the mess. I'm afraid I will leave that maybe to the Q&A, and I'm curious to see whether some economists have some bright ideas how we can possibly get out of this crisis in a way that not only, and that is another thing what I'm trying to do. I first thought I'm only going to talk about the European Union. After all, this is the European Studies Conference. But then I thought one of the problems of this crisis is that we sort of do so much navel gazing. In fact, one of the stupidest things we've done is to construct this as a European crisis. This is not a European crisis. If it is a crisis, it's a global crisis. And this is something I want to contextualize this war, both within the context of the European Union, but also within the global context. Okay, let me see whether I can do that in 36 minutes. I'll try, because ideally, I would really like to get your feedback. You know, I'm not only here to talk to you, ideally I also would like to hear a little bit back from you. And if only that you're completely irritated, that is also helpful, right? Okay, so in European Union studies, the Russian war of aggression, I call it a war of aggression because there's no other word, right? This is nothing about me being very upset about this war. It is a fact that this is a war of aggression against Ukraine. And the way we approach it is a sort of yet another crisis in a whole string of crises the European Union has been facing over. Well, depending, ever since I started studying the European Union has been in crisis. And in fact, some people argue European integration has only moved forward as a result of crisis. So crisis is actually good news for European integration. I'm not so sure about that. There might be a limit of crisis a polity can muster, but this is just, a few examples of the most recent crises the European Union has been facing. Heike Klüver speaks of perma-crisis. And the big question then is whether the Ukraine is just another crisis the European Union has to deal with, or whether this is a new type of crisis, right? That is sort of the whole idea of it that presents to ourselves as a Zeitenwende. So it's not something we can muddle through as we have done in the past, but that is sort of things are so totally different that we actually need a completely new approach to whatever. And the Zeitenwende, I admit, I'm German, and it was my chancellor who presented that concept, but it has already, it has become like certain terms that become sort of then international language, right? Zeitenwende, I think, is one of them. He used it in his speech in the Bundestag to essentially tell the Germans the good days are over. We are living in completely new times. We have to change our foreign policy, forget about the peace dividend. We have to, essentially what he was saying, we have to finally invest in our army, right? So that it can eventually participate into some real war. That was the whole point about that Zeitenwende speech. But of course, in order to justify the investment of 100 billion euro extra Sondervermögen, what is that? An extra, extra investment fund. You have to give some reason here, right? So he essentially said that all the premises upon which German foreign policy used to be based for essentially after the end of the Cold War or even further back were proven wrong. We have to start from scratch and finally understand that change through a peaceful change through interdependence, engaging with each other, doesn't necessarily work. Well, I resist the temptation to go back and use some political science theories why this whole idea of peaceful change through mutual engagement is not, it wasn't that simple, right? There were certain scope conditions that arguably German governments have increasingly ignored. But that's not the point of my presentation. I want to focus on the question to what extent really Ukraine, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, is not only yet another crisis, but really presents itself as a Zeitenwende, as something, as a game changer. And the answer is no. Let me briefly explain why that is. What is a crisis? A crisis is an existential threat that requires decisive action, right? It's not that crisis automatically results in catastrophe, but if you don't do something about the crisis, it might as well result in catastrophe. So crisis in the European Union has time and again presented as a make or break issue for the European Union. Either we finally make the big leap towards the United States of Europe, or the EU is toast. You get these arguments in various, it comes in themes, but ultimately the solution that a lot of European Union scholars offer in response to any crisis, from the Euro crisis to COVID-19 to the Ukraine crisis, is essentially to argue we need to deepen European integration. We need to more majority voting so that the European Union can act decisively. We also need to give the European Union more competencies, particularly in the area of external security, so that the EU can act more decisively. That is sort of the bottom line, right? And then there are people like me who've been arguing for a long time that this is not going to do the trick. I'm not saying that more competences for the European Union ain't necessarily a bad thing, but to believe that it solves all our problems. But that is also not something I'm going to talk about today. I'm talking about what is behind that crisis and to what extent the crisis is actually, what makes this crisis different? Maybe not a Zeitenwende, I don't know. But the European Union has been responding to this crisis as it has responded to any of the other crises, right? So what is this crisis about? Or why do some people argue it really is a different kind of crisis? Or what is sort of the Zeitenwende aspect of this crisis. And the whole point is weaponized interdependence. Are you familiar with this concept? Interdependence is, right, but weaponized interdependence, it comes from Henry Farrer and Abe Newman. And at least in political science, a lot of theories are based upon the assumption that interdependence actually is a good thing, right? Interdependence fostered by, for instance, trade liberalization, right, generates economic growth and therefore is a good thing, with the caveat that it needs to be managed. You need institutions to, to sort of reap the benefits of, first of all, to foster interdependence, but then also to make sure that it produces positive externalities and that you constrain the negative externalities that come with interdependence. Interdependence can also lead to conflict. That was sort of the key challenge, at least in political science. What kind of institutions do you need in order to promote interdependence, but at the same time make sure that conflicts that arise with interdependence are managed, so that actually interdependence, the net effect of interdependence is positive rather than negative. That is one thing. That interdependence can actually become a problem, right? That it can be used, weaponized, used as a tool in conflict, right? Some people even argue it's a form of violence. I'm not so sure about that. But if you use interdependent relationship as a mean of coercion, right? That is sort of, I'm not sure whether it's a new quality, but it goes against this whole idea of peaceful change through engagement, right? Wandel durch Handel, so change through trade, or Wandel durch Annäherung, change through approximations, through mutual engagement. This whole idea that the more you interact, the more likely it becomes that or the less likely it becomes that you will resort to violence to solve conflicts, right? That is sort of the underpinning assumption of a lot of theories. Again, at least in political science, but I bet it's also true for some theories you use in economics. So interdependence used to be a good thing. Now we have sort of, well, maybe not, right? This whole idea of weaponized interdependence, which then comes with, so what are we going to do about that, right? I mean, the most radical solution, I'm going to a conference, Stefanie Walter is coming with me, International Relations section of the German Political Science Association meets for 2 days, and there are quite some panel on de-globalization. I never heard the term actually, de-globalization, which very often then is defined as decreasing interdependence, right? Or decoupling, I think is one of these concepts. Ursula von der Leyen has sort of introduced the term de-risking, which I think we don't quite know what it is. But if you think about interdependence, that comes with vulnerability and sensitivity. That is the two dimensions we use in political science to say, if we want to manage interdependence, we have to make sure that the vulnerabilities that come with it are sort of constrained, right? Or it becomes a problem, particularly if it's asymmetrical. The term asymmetrical interdependence got completely lost, which might have something to do that most of the participants are sort of in their early 30s and haven't read, the 1970s books about interdependence. But so it is about asymmetrical interdependence more than anything else. But that is just a qualifier. So it's de-risking. Then, since our interdependence is we depend on asymmetrically on energy with regard to Russia, on security with regard to the US, and on trade with China. So with regard to energy with Russia, that is our biggest problem at the moment. We decarbonize our economies, right? Because it's oil and gas we get from Russia, which is nice because it's sort of how you say, it gives a boost to the green transition. We wanted to get out of coal and gas anyway. It's going to be a little bit faster now. And hey, we're also going to get out of nuclear energy. It's a little bit, a lot at the moment, but we're going to manage. So that is, and we have the whole discussion about strategic autonomy, right? The EU needs to be less, not necessarily decoupled from the US, but at least should be able to act alone when its security interests are at stake. which is again a way of saying the war in Ukraine is essentially a European problem, and we should be able to deal with this problem without the help of our big brother in the US. Again, a really stupid construction of the problem, particularly given that the US is by far the largest supporter of Ukraine at the moment, right? Together with the European Union, yes, but if the US pulls out, we have a big problem. But anyway, so if you take this together, these three strategies the European Union and its member states have developed to deal with this crisis, the bottom line is we need to deepen European integration, and that's new, that is really new, we need to widen it. Enlargement is back, right? After the enlargement fatigue of the EU for more than 20 years, all of a sudden, enlargement again is the solution to a major challenge, namely how to reconstruct Ukraine once this war is hopefully over. And secondly, how to, now we're thinking geopolitics, how to draw or how to protect, as some would say, other states in the East that feel threatened and are possibly threatened by Russia, right? And so enlargement is back on the agenda. Ukraine and Moldova received a candidate status. Georgia still has a perspective here too. And giving a candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova immediately also brought back the Western Balkans. There's still 6 countries in the loop, right? That have some of them have started accession negotiations. So that is a difference. And with regard to the other crises, the previous crisis was about deepening only. Now it's deepening and widening. And in EU studies, there is a strong belief that before you enlarge, you need to deepen. So it's deepening and widening, and it is deepening before widening. So we are back in discussions of which competences the EU needs, how we have to change our decision-making processes, how we have to reform agricultural policy. I mean, Ukraine, it's not only a big country, it has a big agricultural sector. It's going to tank our common agricultural policy. So we're back in the discussions we had in the 1990s when the Big Bang Eastern enlargement was in the cards, right? How do we need to reform the EU and its institutions to make it fit for the next enlargement round? So the whole point is deepening and widening. Now, what this whole discussion misses is what this war actually is about. Right? It is a very inward-looking perspective of the EU trying to think how it can best prepare for the consequences of this war. And what is completely missing is the global context here. And so this is not a war about democracy, the rule of law, and all the liberal principles we care so much about. It is also about that, but it is predominantly a war that violates every fundamental principles the international order after the Second World War was built around, liberal or not. It depends how you define liberal. You know, they're liberal with capital L and liberal with small l, but each and every state that is a member to the United Nations has signed up to these principles. Prohibition of violence, sovereign equality, territorial integrity. These are not intrinsically liberal values. Therefore, the majority of the states in the world which are not liberal, have signed up to it, right? So, and Putin's war against Ukraine has violated every single principle. That is at the core of our international order, even if you throw out the adjective of liberal. That is the problem of this war. And because it is not about liberal principles per se, it is not only a European or Western problem, it is a global problem. If we give up on these principles, okay, we can do that. But then think about the implications, right? I mean, some people would argue those are the sort of the necessary conditions for order, for as opposed to chaos, right? And or at least a world in which the powerful states essentially dominate. And if you frame it that way, it becomes much easier to argue against the global South countries, including India, South Africa, Brazil, and say, this is your war. We have nothing to do with it. You know, if you think you want to democratize Ukraine and you want a regime change in Russia, Your problem. You fight that war. That is none of our business. Plus, you know, then you get all the hypocrisy and all these arguments against the so-called West. Now, if you frame it in terms of fundamental principles that have sustained the international order for more than 70 years, and ask countries like India how they felt if we gave up on the principle of sovereign equality and territorial integrity, or China for that matter, you get a different discourse, right? So it is really interesting. Of course, the European security architecture was blown up by this war. There's no question about it. But again, the European security architecture was not exclusively built around the protection of liberal values. It was about restating these principles, right? And just as a reminder, the Soviet Union, okay, within the Warsaw Pact was a different story, but outside the Warsaw Pact states, there was the Brezhnev Doctrine that fundamentally compromised the idea of sovereign equality and territorial integrity. Hungary, 1956, Prague, 1968, Warsaw, 1981, we know that, right? But outside, the Soviet Union has always accepted these principles. At least it has not blatantly violated them, or even worse, kissed them goodbye and said, we don't care about them anymore, right? So, and the European security architecture that was established after the end of the Cold War reconfirmed these principles. The Helsinki of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. There it was decided that borders must not be changed by violence. You can change borders in Europe. You can. But this needs to be done in mutual agreement, right? The Paris Charter then restated these principles. And I want to just, all these people, I come back to that, that claim that the West broke its promise not to enlarge NATO eastwards. This promise, if it has ever been made, has never been put into writing. What has been put into writing is the promise by Russia to accept and respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of the Ukraine in return of the Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. There was a huge debate. I mean, I don't know how, well, some of you must have been alive at the time. There was a debate whether whether Ukraine should give up its nuclear weapons, right? And Mersheimer, a very famous political scientist, essentially argued that would be very stupid. In fact, giving up nuclear weapons, he actually argued the contrary. He also advocated that countries like Germany should get nuclear weapons. So he was actually arguing against the Budapest Memorandum. But there was a security assurance by Russia, like saying, and so Ukraine already at the time was concerned about Russia, or at the time it was still the Soviet Union. No, it wasn't. 1994, it was Russia. Russia, respecting its territorial integrity and its sovereignty. Okay, now we over here. Yes, Putin's wars, two tails, right? And it's not only two tails. It is two different strands in political science. Even within, so it's sort of international relations against domestic politics, comparative politics. Although the first tale about national security is hugely contested also among international relations scholars. But the argument essentially is that Putin's war against Ukraine is essentially a response to NATO enlargement and EU enlargement, which is essentially seen as a security threat. That's also very much part of his discourse back home. He says, but also internationally, he is saying the West is sort of pushing eastwards into its sphere of influence, and he's actually claiming that the West wants to sort of, eliminate Russia from the face of the earth. And the evidence he uses is NATO enlargement. And I mean, just to show you, this is the map, right? So this is how NATO looks in 2022. The blue countries, the green countries. I mean, I haven't really changed it in the meantime. So Finland has joined NATO, and Finland has a 3,000-kilometer border with Russia, right? And Sweden, eventually, Erdogan will come around or will be bought off, and Sweden will join. So, I mean, you can see, I have also mapped this over time, but I think the point is clear. You know, I mean, NATO has enlarged, and ironically, part of its recent enlargement, even in Switzerland, they're now talking about discussing whether Switzerland should maybe consider becoming part of NATO. This has been fueled by Putin's, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the argument essentially is the West has threatened Russia, and this is sort of a preemptive strike against an eastwards extending NATO. Okay, that is the one story, right? And it is sort of, so we created the security dilemma because we promised Russia to never enlarge NATO eastwards, right? To respect its sphere of influence approach. And so it is essentially our fault. That is, and this narrative is not only advanced by Putin, it is shared by a considerable part of the German public, by certain politicians, but also by international relations scholars like John Mersheimer, who now, this war creates strange bedfellows. Noam Chomsky, you know Noam Chomsky? He is at the same side as Mersheimer in arguing it is essentially, Putin is simply defending Russia against an aggressive West. And Mersheimer would also add that this urge to empire after the end of the Cold War, the fact that, you know, the liberal triumphalism with the demise of the Soviet Union, the one major alternative to liberalism disappeared, and that sort of created this hubris of the West to believe that the world, to globalize liberalism, that everyone has to become liberal, and it's now sort of a liberal imperialism that has pushed eastwards, and now finally Russia is fighting back, and therefore China is supporting Russia, and India is supporting Russia, and there is something to this discourse, right? It is about the universal claim of liberalism that some interpret as a liberal imperialism, and so Putin is simply pushing back. That is the one story, and there's a very sophisticated international relation theory that has been used to sustain these claims. If you hold it against evidence, it doesn't hold, because there's no, you go back in the historical archives, there's not a single piece of paper in which you find a promise of the US or NATO to never expand eastward. In fact, coming back to the Paris Charter, it clearly says that countries have the freedom, the right to choose the alliances they want to join. And Russia, at the time it was still the Soviet Union, signed the Paris Charter. So, you know, I mean, I don't know what individual politicians might have or might have not promised Yeltsin, but on paper, what we have is, on the one hand, the freedom of countries, the sovereignty of countries to choose the alliances they want to join, and the promise of Russia to respect the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of Ukraine as a state, right? So that we have on paper. Russia signed up to that. And okay, now, the second interpretation is that this war is not about the national security of Russia. It's about the survival of the political regime of Putin, right? It's about regime survival. And what is the greatest threat to regime survival is not NATO enlargement per se as a security alliance. It is what comes with NATO enlargement, namely democratization. NATO has a clear democracy clause by now, right? So does the EU. So NATO only accepts now, was different in the past, but now only accepts countries that clearly endorse what we call the liberal script, democracy cum market economy, right? So NATO enlargement is essentially a security guarantee for democratizing countries, right? So that is essentially the argument. So that you integrate into the West in order to anchor your democratization process. That is the story of the end of after the end of the Cold War, with Eastern enlargement, arguably, right? And but there's also a broader argument by someone like John Peterhouse, for instance, and there is big data that shows that countries that make the transition and that are on the path or the escalator towards liberal democracy tend to join liberal international or regional organizations to anchor, to lock in their democratic reforms, right? And so there is NATO enlargement and EU enlargement are connected to this regime survival argument. But what is at stake is not the national security of Russia. What is at stake is the regime survival of a non-liberal authoritarian regime that is threatened by countries that democratize in its immediate neighborhood, right? And what I want to show you here is a very crude measurement of democratization, of the democratic, liberal democratic. I mean, there are different ways you can measure democracy. This is from VDEM. They have sort of varieties of democracy. This is the liberal democracy index. Why liberal democracy? Because this is what the EU, in particular, Copenhagen criteria, are really about. And what you can see is here you have East European countries in the immediate neighborhood of Russia, and you can see there's some countries who have made substantial progress in democratization and others haven't, right? And there is a clear correlation, and this is what I show you in the next slide. There's a clear correlation that those countries who made substantial progress were those countries, and this is why it's called Putin's wars, that faced military aggression by Russia. Every time a country made a significant progress with a certain time lag, I could run a beautiful regression. I didn't. I stayed away from that, particularly when I'm facing such an audience. But my stats teacher always said, if you can't see it, you don't need to run a regression, right? I mean, there is an interesting correlation between substantial improvements in democracy and some sort of aggression by Russia, either openly military or other attempts to destabilize the country by sending special operation forces in there, by fueling territorial conflict. So this is just a very crude, but hopefully getting the point across list of acts of aggression of Russia against neighboring countries. And again, the correlation is with a certain time lag is clear. I don't walk you through this in detail. I'm happy to go back to that. The big picture is whenever a country takes a decision, when you have elections, for instance, when one of these, when an authoritarian leaning pro-Russian government is voted out of power, you can be sure that with a certain time lag, there will be some sort of, Russia will somehow interfere either directly, militarily, or indirectly. And these are just a few. And this is why these frozen conflicts are, why freezing the conflict in Ukraine is not a solution. Because history shows, there is evidence that Putin is systematically using these frozen conflicts to, whenever a country is moving in a direction that threatens his regime survival, he will sort of defreeze the conflict or reheat the conflict, right? So freezing the conflict is not going to get us out of this war, at least not, it's not sustainable. Okay, so coming back to the EU, if the point is that this is not about Russia's national security interest, maybe, but sort of not predominantly, but if it's really about the survival of Putin's regime, right? That has huge implications about how possibilities how to sort of contain end this war. But first of all, let me briefly walk you through how the EU has actually responded to this war. And I'm going to repeat very quickly what I already said before. I mean, the good news is the EU has been remarkably united, right? In an area in which the EU has not been particularly united in the past. I mean, and foreign security and defense policy is still the least integrated part of the European Union. It is still very much functions like an international organization, intergovernmental bargaining, very little majority voting, no real role for supranational actors such as the Commission, not to mention the European Court of Justice or the European Parliament. So you remember the Maastricht Treaty with the 3 pillars, where the internal and external security part was sealed off from the supranationalized single market and economic and monetary union. The internal security part by now has completely subsumed, right, under the supranationalized part. That's why we don't have the pillars anymore. But security, foreign security and defense in particular policy have largely resisted Europeanization to much greater extent than any other areas of European integration, with maybe the exception of tax and a few. But I mean, and economic policy, by the way, right? We have a monetary union without an economic union, but that's a different story. Coming back here. So despite the fact that the member states have had a hard time in the past to come up with a common position in the war against Syria, Africa, we can go through various international crises. The EU has never been really united. In fact, very often you found member states on different sides. France and Italy on every single issue in Africa, right? So, and plus having a few governments, populist parties included, that are good friends with Putin. And I was really surprised how united the member states were in taking action against Russia. Sanctions, I think we're now negotiating currently the 11th sanction package. And we know from research that sanctions don't do a thing in terms of ending a war or, you know, making an authoritarian, aggressive regime cave in. Still, these sanctions are important, right? If only symbolically. And sometimes they do actually have an impact, but it takes a longer time. So, but 11th, you know, I mean, this is a huge sanction package by now, unanimously approved. Then military support, humanitarian, financial assistance, the reception of hundreds of thousands of refugees by a country like Poland that before had refused to accept a single refugee. Again, you know, I mean, things have happened in the European Union. A lot of EU scholars wouldn't have thought that they were possible. So that was a kind of a surprise. And that's what then some of us argue that this is really a making point now. Finally, European Union. Wars make states. So this was going to make the European Union finally into the United States of Europe. We were going to become a federal state. Read Dan Kellerman and Kate McNamara. They have a beautiful theoretical argument, which then got completely debunked by a whole bunch of other EU scholars for ignoring history. But we have finally an interesting debate again in EU studies, right? But it's again about make or break moment for the European Union. The European Union has to become finally a state to take care of its own business. This brings us then down here, right? But again, the widening is back on the agenda. We're talking about accepting, this is making the EU fit for 35. I thought I was asked to write a piece for a Swedish think tank, and I thought 2035. No, what they meant was making the EU fit for 35 member states. Before 35, actually. So widening, you know, enlargement is back. I already talked about that. And in order to facilitate widening, we need to deepen. I already explained that. So I'm moving to the end. Now, the problem is, if that is the answer, the response of the EU and its member states to the current war in Ukraine, from the perspective of both theoretical tales about what this war is actually about, it's going to be a disaster. Why? Because no matter whether you believe this is, or what we believe, whether this war is about national security of Russia or Putin's regime survival, the strategies of the European Union will sort of are a problem for both arguments. It comes enlargement with the EU will be impossible without NATO enlargement, because there's the one thing the EU cannot deliver, and that is a security guarantee. We do have what is a Beistandsklausel in English? Beistandsklausel. Article 5 NATO.
Defense clause.
Solidarity clause. Solidarity, thank you. Solidarity clause. The European Union has a solidarity clause. clause too. And it not only pertains to military aggression, it's much broader. The problem is the EU doesn't have the troops to defend anyone who is attacked by anyone, right? We just don't have the troops. We don't have the infrastructure. So we will need NATO anyway. And I don't think we will ever get to the point that we will be able to defend, say, Ukraine or Moldova against another Russian aggression without the Americans. This is just completely, unlikely, shall we say. So if that is the case, and Macron just said it a few days ago, we need to give Ukraine security guarantees. Now, who's going to give Ukraine security guarantees? The European Union? Not very credible. So it's got to be NATO. So we will have, with enlargement of the EU, we will have NATO enlargement, right? And in fact, if you take Georgia, or I believe this is probably also true for Ukraine, what they want most is security. Security, and then eventually access to the single market, which will be a disaster for Ukraine economy anytime soon. But you're the economist. But there is something about a certain economic convergence you need even in a single market, not to mention a common currency. So EU enlargement will certainly come with either an EU security guarantee, which I don't see, or NATO enlargement. So it will reinforce this. If there is a threat to Russia's national security, it will become even stronger, right? And also from the regime survival perspective, if the EU accepts Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, maybe possibly Armenia, which is sort of very disillusioned by the fact that Russia doesn't do much to stand by it in this whole Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan, right? So if all these countries that are in the immediate neighborhood of Russia that are not yet part of the European Union orbit, when they will be sucked in and integrated, that will also increase the threat for Putin's regime survival, because he will be surrounded by democratizing countries, right? So it is sort of completely overdetermined. From both perspectives, what has fueled this war will be even reinforced. So in a way, if this is how the European Union intends to end that war, and also sort of sustainably, I don't see how this is going to happen. Finally, I become even more pessimistic. If this is the way the European Union tends to deal with this war, this will also have huge repercussions for the liberal international order, because it will reinforce the regionalization of the liberal international order, right? Because this orbit will be defined by a core of liberal values. We're going to be a club, we're already a club of democracies, and we can discuss about Hungary and Poland, but they are still in that broader framework of, they're not a Putin regime yet. And if the EU does one thing, it might actually prevent that from happening. So we're going to define our order by explicitly liberal, which then excludes the majority of countries in the world who do not and who don't want to be liberal. I mean, that might be shocking to some of us, but this is just the way it is, right? The majority of countries in the world are not liberal. And one of the big successes of the liberal international order with small capital was that it provided a global order with variable geometry. But China has signed as many human rights conventions as the US. So there is no substantial difference with regard to the buy-in of liberal and non-liberal states in core institutions of the international order, right? It used to be a global order. It has become less global after the end of the Cold War, because what Michael Zun and I have called the liberal intrusiveness of international institutions has increased, which ironically has benefited China tremendously. The rise of China would not have been able without the liberal international economic order, right? Let's not forget that. But if we push certain liberal principles, we will exclude countries like China, which are not liberal and which do not want to become liberal, but which have bought into the liberal international order to some extent at least. We will push them out. So it will be the liberal rest against the illiberal rest. And some people might think then it's just the case, right? Then we will decouple and we will have clubs. And I leave the economic implications to you. And here I stop. I hope I haven't gone too, well, I have been too long. But I'll stop here and look forward to your, well, maybe hopefully not so irritated questions and comments.
Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions. Yes, maybe there is a microphone there.
So I hope my question will not be found irritating.
Maybe it's the microphone on because
Yeah, it is on.
Yes, okay.
Okay, so I'm an economist, so I don't really know how much weapons and humanitarian aid can help in this situation to Ukraine and but what I know is that over the past decades, money laundering in European countries, for instance, in Denmark, and money laundering of the post-Soviet oligarchs hasn't had the situation. So I would like to know your view on that.
Yes, this is a very good point. I guess what you're saying is, in a way, the European Union has officially promoted democracy, but through some of its policies actually supported authoritarian, corrupt regimes by allowing them to launder money. I mean, there's so many ways, and you're so right. But what are the implications? I mean, the implications would be that the European Union starts getting tough, and it has started, but still, I mean, you know, the Russian oligarchs, I mean, the European Union has been very careful when it comes to assets, and they're moving into the direction, but it's not very popular. But I would fully agree with you. We need, if we support countries abroad in their democratization process against Russia, we also need to, you know, sort of, if you want, I don't know, I don't say fight Russia, but we also then need to stop allowing member states to sustain Putin's regime through these kind of schemes of money laundering and others. And also, that is one of the big challenges for the European Union, that countries like Georgia, you have governments that have no interest in liberalizing their country. They want to stay in power. And in fact, if they implemented the reforms the EU is promoting, that is the idea of the European Union, it would be voted out of power. So, but since they have a very pro-liberal population, they can simply say, screw liberalism, right? So what they do is they subvert some of the policies the EU is pushing them to implement. To give you an example, the de-oligarchization law, right? That is a major condition of the EU for closer relations. And what do these governments do with it? They declare everyone whom they don't like as an oligarch, and some of them, I mean, truth to be told, right? I mean, there is an issue here also with fight against corruption, but the degree of corruption is more or less broadly dispersed. So, I mean, they go after those that are the most powerful opponents they have and put them in prison. And that, so what I'm saying here is, not only do the member states themselves undermine the EU's policies, the EU's policies themselves are used by countries, right? And the EU allows that to happen in a way that corrupt and authoritarian governments are actually empowered to some extent rather than disempowered. What is actually the intention of the policy? And that's a major challenge, yes.
Yeah, so my question comes back to your point about weaponized interdependence. And it also comes back to a quote made by Theodore Roosevelt about, in geopolitics, speak softly but carry a big stick. It seems that Russia has been perfectly fine with using that big stick to get whatever they want. But it also seems that the West has sort of been very reluctant to use a big stick in terms of economic warfare. And so my question is, to what extent has this reluctance of like the West to use this sort of economic warfare against Russia, or the threat to use it whenever they would cross certain lines, led to the current situation? And if that's true, what are the reasons for that? Why have we been so reluctant to do that?
How much time do I have? it comes back to the starting point of my talk is this a Zeitenwende? I mean, are certain fundamental beliefs we held that also served certain economic interests, right? So shaken that we now have to reverse our approach completely. And I mean, the area you're talking about, I'm not too familiar, but what we're discussing is this energy dependency. Why on earth did we do that? Why did we make ourselves so dependent? I mean, from an economic point of view, it doesn't make it sort of risk. When you risk management, you don't put all your eggs in one basket. You shouldn't even do that with a country that is maybe closer to your own values, right? I mean, you have a portfolio, you do risk. So why did we do it? And I think a lot had to do with the situation. Well, it's complex, obviously, but one of the key reasons, I think, at least for the Merkel government, is if you want to get out of coal and nuclear power at the same time, it costs a lot of money, right? It's very expensive. So if you then have the opportunity to sort of, because we hadn't invested that much in renewables. So in order to manage the transition, cheap gas from Russia seemed to be a good option, right? Plus, at the time, we had reason, there was still this belief, Wandel durch Handel, change, peaceful change through engagement. So rather than containing and deterring Russia, let's engage Russia and trading with Russia, buying cheap gas. And there was this whole idea of a modernization partnership. So to be fair, it was part of a larger strategy. That it also served certain economic interests. Absolutely. But I think you also need, economic interests alone don't do the trick. In politics, you always need a justification. Here come the collective belief systems in. And if the assumption is that Putin is not an aggressive guy who will do everything to stay in power, right? And will at least respect the fundamental principles of the Paris Charter that organizes not only the liberal international order, but also the European security architecture. Why is it such a problem to be energy dependent on Russia? And there were people after 2014, when it was clear that Putin wasn't maybe not as such a nice guy as some, including our former chancellor, thought he was and still thinks. When after the annexation of the Crimea, economists time and again said we need to get out of our dependency on Russian oil and gas. And why didn't we do it? It's because of economic interests. And these economic interests is not the sort of the corporate interest there. It is also rich states, eastern states in Germany that have, that to some extent their economies depend on Russian gas imports. So, and here you have politicians, right? I mean, as long as shit doesn't hit the fan, you try to preserve the status quo. And I think if you take that together, it explains a lot that a lot of the things that would have been economically possible and also effective politically weren't chosen, because the costs, the distribution of costs is in a way that you as a politician, you will be hurt, right? I know this is always what political scientists do. They always tell economists when they ask why do certain things not work or why they are not chosen. But this is what it is about. It's about electoral politics, right?
I hope you don't mind if I play the devil's advocate, actually, and it comes in two parts, basically. First of all, couldn't one make an argument that why the Ukraine war actually started is also linked to the Minsk agreements, which were not implemented. Sorry, the Minsk agreements, which were not implemented by Ukraine. And I would actually go one step back. Ukraine was forced to sign these agreements by Western powers with conditions which were just unacceptable for this country. And so you could say the separatists had a good argument to go against that, basically. Following up on that, isn't that what will happen in the end? There will be Minsk 3, which will do exactly the same thing because of the arguments that were made just before, given that the Western powers don't want to get out the big sticks. Tom, that was it.
No, absolutely. I don't disagree at all. And I should also add, Ukraine was not a democratic country when that war started. And we don't know, and the big challenge is to make sure that Ukraine, when we rebuild it, and I mean we, as the European Union together with the US, that it will become a democratic country. But that, for me, is not a foregone conclusion. That's why I'm saying Ukraine is not fighting for democracy. Ukraine is fighting for its existence as a sovereign country. It has every right to do that, right? But Ukraine is not fighting for our democracy and freedom. I think this is a wrong, framing. Not only because it makes this a war of the West, also because it is not clear to me whether Ukraine will actually develop in a liberal democracy. And what I'm really worried about is this idea of accelerated accession to the European Union. I mean, Ukraine is nowhere close, neither economically nor politically. We start with corruption and we end with the agricultural sector. So, and that's also with the mix. So Ukraine was not a kind of completely innocent victim, right? But that doesn't give Russia the right to invade Ukraine. Whatever mistakes were made, there is no excuse for these fundamental violations of this principle. And that is then my answer to your second point. Yes, the Western powers might not want to really address the issues and all the economic, the vested interests there. But if we don't do it, there won't be a sustainable solution. People who really, there's no evidence that freezing the conflict will be sustainable, right? So we will have we might actually have to deal time and again with these destabilizing efforts of Russia. Then we will have conflict flaring up. And we're not only talking about Ukraine, we're talking about Moldova, we're talking about Georgia. And if I tend to believe that the European Union has an economic interest and a security interest of sort of sustainably ending this conflict, right? Also migration pressures. I mean, we haven't talked about migration at all, but if there's no stability in the region, the negative externalities for the European Union will be immense. So I just hope that politicians are willing to realize that a Minsk III agreement won't solve the problem, and it will actually become more costly in the future. So, I mean, and if you ask me now, what is the solution? I don't have one. I'm not a peace and conflict person. I can only tell that the strategies the European Union is currently pursuing are very unlikely to actually provide a sustainable solution to the situation, and in fact might actually make things worse. On that happy note.
I think, can you hear me now? Maybe better. Okay. I think the missing piece here is American domestic politics. Mm-hmm. So something that unites Americans like nothing else is hating on Russia. And so if you look at American politics and elections, something that guarantees re-election is a war. So my forecast is this war will continue until the next election. And this is to ensure that the next Biden bid is successful. Because this is a very low-cost war to America, relatively speaking. The bulk of the cost is borne by Europeans, really, in terms of troops, right? There's no boots on the ground. America can certainly afford to, send a few, weapons to Ukraine. I mean, it's certainly feasible. So I do not see any attempt to end this war anytime soon. If soon means the next year. Yeah, so this is basically what I think.
Okay, two things. The rally around the flag effect is a powerful one, right? I mean, and it not only works for democracies, it also works for non-democracies. So that you sort of create a common enemy that unites people domestically against the common enemy. But I don't think by any part of the year in Wyoming and 75% Trump country, so I don't have hardly any Democrats to talk to, and their other is China and not Russia. So if there is a common enemy, it is China, and you can see what the Trump administration, but also the Biden administration has continued the policies of the Trump administration. directly against China. And some people actually argue that the war, that the support, the American support for the war and for Ukraine and the war against Russia is actually as much a signaling to China, don't even think about it, right? So I'm not so sure whether this is really about Russia or whether this is a signaling device. That's my first point. The second, against China. China is much easier to unite Republicans and Democrats against China because you have the Democratic workers, right? I mean, there is a coalition here. Russia, the isolationists, also by the way in the Democratic Party, they are not quite convinced. And the other day I talked to the Ukrainian opposition, a member of the opposition said we have to have a successful counter, offensive now. If we fail with this offensive, the US might simply withdraw its support, right? Because of the elections, and Americans may ask, why on earth are we supporting the war? What does this war have to do with us? There's a lot of money going there, maybe not troops yet, but so, I mean, actually, I'm more worried about the elections undermining US support than actually Europe. With China, I would agree. And that is what makes the Europeans worry, right? Because as much as we talk about de-risking, decoupling from China is something also for economic reasons, but not only for economic reasons. You know, Europeans are very unlikely to do. So if Biden is pushing his anti-China politics, this again might actually has a certain divisive, you say, dividing the Western alliance. So I really hope that he's not pushing too far, because that could actually increase the tensions within the Western alliance, and anything that increases tensions within the Western alliance strengthens Russia and China from a realist point of view. So let's see.
Just to conclude, 1 minute to ask a question. So, what are then your expectations? So I know that it's a big question, but what's gonna happen? So it's in terms of scenario, if you have to.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to.
Yes.
Look, I mean, I think there are two possible big scenarios. Coming back to my regionalization tendencies, I think the West has to make up its mind what it wants, right? If we use the liberal script, as we call it, so the liberal values, to unite ourselves, and we are a club of liberal democracies, and we sort of de-risking essentially means, how is it now? French shoring, is that what you call it? French shoring, right? So we sort of try to shorten our value chains and try to concentrate them within the sphere, the sphere of liberal democracies, right? So that would essentially mean a deepening of the regionalization in the international order, which will have huge economic costs because of the importance of China. Not only China, but the future markets. I'm the economist, but I always hear future markets are in Africa, for instance, right? And the majority of African countries are not liberal democracies, right? So if we deepen the liberal international order as a regional order with capital L, we exclude a lot of countries we might want to, and we probably need to do business with, and we also need to address issues like climate change, right? So, but Biden's, I mean, at the very beginning, this whole club of democracies and we exclude, that was sort of a tendency. And with deepening liberal international institutions, deepening their liberal purpose, right? And their liberal authority, that is a danger. The other scenario would be we roll back the capital L, liberal international order. We tune down, we we reduce the liberal intrusiveness, as we say. So we don't insist on democracy. We keep the basic human rights, but this whole debate about liberal democracy, we tune all that down, focus on these sort of core principles of the liberal international order, make sure that everybody, we sort of reassure ourselves that we all agree that territorial integrity and sovereignty equality actually is what unites us. which also means giving the global south a greater say at the table, not only China. China is actually a permanent member of the UN Security Council. What the heck is China complaining about? You know, I mean, China is not the point. China is powerful enough. No, but there are countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, all the rising emerging economies, right? Giving them a greater say, including them in an international order. So we need a kind of a new bar game, if you want, right? So these are the two options. Both are probably not very likely to, these are sort of ideal type. But I think signaling is important here. And Moody is as bad, if not worse, as Orban, Kaczynski, Netanyahu, Bolsonaro, or Trump. But celebrating Moody as a strategic, I mean, so, but if we want to sort of, I don't think we prevent Moody by excluding him from our Club of Liberal Democracies, but rather inviting India and all these countries who are sort of on the edge and saying, look, you want to be a liberal democracy, then for God's sake, behave like a liberal democracy. And don't say, well, the liberal democracies of the West don't comply with their values, why should we? So we need to have a different discourse, right? And so again, an invitation to come together, but I think that's probably also not very likely to happen. So I don't want to end with a doomsday scenario, but I do think that we have moved a little bit too far with our ideas, and if we want to maintain the international order as a global order, we need to become more inclusive in the sense of giving countries a greater say that are not liberal, right? But maybe not as bad as, say, North Korea or so. Yeah, well, there's something in between, right? So a little bit more pragmatic.
Thank you so much. This is super interesting, and I would keep going, but I think we should stop here. And thank you so much, Tanja.
Well, thank you.